Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tiki Bar. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Imran Patel. He is the founder and CEO of Syft Data. Imran, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I always start with the same opening question. When you were a kid, so a little Imran running around in India, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a scientist. I didn't know what kind of scientist, but I wanted to be a scientist.
Did you have like particular hobbies involved in the sciences, or how did that play out for you as a kid?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, there was just like a lot of crazy experiments I would do in my backyard, but like I guess most kids do. Um, and I see it now in my son as well, my older one. And so like it probably passed down or something, but yeah, that's where it started. I always liked science as a kid, and so I was okay at math, although I got progressively better at it later on. But science was something that I really loved, kind of doing at school, even like on like setting up crazy stuff. Yeah.
What kind of crazy stuff? Can you give me anything you remember that comes to mind when I think of Imran's crazy experiments?
I think it involved a lot of fire, and sort of gunpowder and like things kind of just blowing up is how I would put it.
I like that. I read. Do you know who Ed Thorpe is? He's a famous. He's kind of like invented quantitative investing,
Right.
but he was a science kid growing up, and he has this great story of how he was actually ready to strap himself to all these balloons, and he actually did it with a test thing, and it went up and caused a bunch of chaos in his neighborhood. So it made me think of that story.
Up in the movie.
Just like in Up, the movie. Nailed it. All right, so you're scientific kid doing crazy experiments. You're getting better at math along the way. What was the first job that you had, and what did it what did it teach you?
Yeah, this is an interesting story. So in India, we don't have this like kind of notion of like here, like in the States, like kids have like a lot of part time jobs, like in high school or so on. So my first paying job didn't happen until I was in, I think, junior or senior year of my undergrad degree, and that's when I got my first internship, and or a paid internship, is I would. So like I only consider a job as paying, like So my paid job was this internship at this little Finnish company called Nokia back then. Uh, it was not little, but like it was like the largest mobile manufacturer in the world. And what it told me, maybe it's a very fascinating story. Now that I look back at it, because the way I got it was the more interesting part in terms of like your second question is like, what did it tell me and what did it teach me? And actually the process of getting it was actually quite illustrative. And so we have like this sort of a practical thing as part of like you're supposed to do your like last semester as an internship, and so there's like a sort of technology project that you have to do. And so most kids where I grew up, you do that in a local company in India, and I just happened to be the person that had to go to Finland to do my internship, which was super weird. And the way I got the job was that before I got the job, the previous summers, me and a friend of mine, we were just dabbling with like networking and trying to understand. Like there was this new technology called IPv6 back then, which would allow like lots more computers to come online on the internet, but nobody, like it was still very early about how to hook up those computers, especially with the older ones that were running IPv4, which is like the most common networking protocol. And so we were kind of just dinking around. We had no idea what the hell we were doing, but like we were like, it was very cutting edge stuff. So we were like setting up this lab in school, in the university, an IPv6 thing, and we didn't know how to make it talk with IPv4. Apparently not much of the world knew about it back then either. There were like a couple of standards or something that were written around it fairly early. And so I went on the internet and I said, like, well, we're trying to do this stuff. How do you connect these things? I know that there is a standard that somebody just wrote, but like you can't. There's this guy from like Nokia. And so nobody replied to me. I think it's just like whatever, a junior from some random place in India. And then in a month later, some guy from Nokia reaches out to me and it's like, did you figure out if anybody has implemented this, that what you were trying to look for? And I was like, no, I couldn't find anything. But, I was just like, it seems interesting enough. Maybe I'll go and implement it myself. But I have a summer thing coming up. So just a random aside, I was just like, yeah, I'll try. And then a few days later, he says like, would you like to do it for us at Nokia? And I'm like, sure, what does that mean? And then he's like, well, we'd like to kind of, and so they just offered me to kind of, so fly up to, so I spent like a very cold Finnish winter. I went from a place where I grew up, which is like 45 Celsius, to a place that was minus 30 Celsius. And so they flew me over, and I spent like an amazing winter there, and worked with some really, really terrific people who are at the forefront of like what we call like, networking and so on, like mobile and so on. So like very interesting experience. I mean, I think for me, the learning there was just that we spent a lot of like, me and a couple of my friends, we would spend a lot of time like just being nerds and like, trying to do stuff, spending our breaks, actually summer breaks, spring breaks, in the lab. And I think it's just like it's just this, like, I think your curiosity gets you very far is how I would put it.
That's good.
And back then I kind of just, I wouldn't have put it that way. Back then I would have said like, oh, you work hard and like, you land into the right place. But I think it's just like there's some combination of working hard plus curiosity about like something new kind of takes you far.
How did you handle that personally? Going from warm weather climate where you grew up to somewhere that's not only like total change in temperature, culturally different. You haven't been away presumably from home for that level of extended period of time before they give you an apartment. Like how did it all go down?
Yeah, it was pretty cool. So this was, I think the internship started around like early February. So they hooked me up with an apartment. I was sharing the apartment with one another intern most of the time, and this apartment was in this place called Espoo, which is like sort of a suburb of Finland. That's where Nokia is kind of headquartered. The language was an issue as well. I mean, I think it's like most European countries, I suppose it's true. Like the younger people speak English very well. The Finns in general speak actually very good English. And so at work, I'd never had communication problems. So if I stepped outside, sometimes there might be, but overall, it was pretty cool. I don't know. It was insanely cold. I think it was probably only the second time in my life that I ever saw snow when I landed at the Helsinki airport, and it was crazy. I don't know. For the first few days, I was just totally just in my apartment, holed up. It was just too cold for me. Finnish winters are just brutal. Yeah. So, but overall, the people were very nice. They kind of, a lot of it was like the diet was very restrictive for me, because I was like trying to, I keep halal, so like, getting, so mostly I was vegetarian. So it was just like, yeah, very, very interesting adjustment period. But over a period of time, I just made friends at work. They understood. They were like, just made me feel home. They could see it, like this guy's kind of, just like, yeah,
Yeah.
struggling. Yes.
Well, good for you. I mean, that's super enriching. I remember I went up to Tromsø in Norway one time for a sales meeting, and I didn't realize it at the time. I thought it was going to be sort of a blend of people, but there's probably going to be about 40 people in the room for a presentation and like a half day of meetings. And I realized that I was going to be the only reason that everyone was going to have to speak English for the day.
Yeah.
I was just like, shit, like I better bring it, right? Because otherwise, and you're going to be able to tell because they're just going to say like, okay, this guy, we're just going to start, speaking our own language, which is totally reasonable.
Yeah.
So I actually excused myself for a little portion of the meeting where I wasn't needed and just kind of sat somewhere else because I was like, let's let them, have their experience here. They obviously all spoke English well, but it was just a funny story.
That's very thoughtful of you. Yeah.
So obviously you're getting into network engineering from a young age in college. Was there a moment when you knew what you were doing, this tinkering and following your curiosity was leading to something where it clicked?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I was a computer science major, or computer engineering major in India, and so I would say, and unlike in the States, we have to pre-declare our major, so you have to kind of say beforehand what major you want to choose,
Oh, interesting.
which is quite a bit different than here. So my first major was actually electrical engineering, and then I kind of switched into computers. And even computer engineering, I wasn't sure. Like I like programming, but I was like not really sure that this was like truly like going to work out. I actually didn't get my computer at home until I was freshman or like beginning of my second year. And so my dad got, and like I came from a very middle class family, so it was like a huge investment back to kind of just get a personal computer. I would just program out of labs, but that's when it kind of really started. Like, once I got my computer and I kind of started like coming up with all sorts of like, again, like you just like what I used to do with like you crazy experiments, like like you just have crazy ideas and you had this magical thing that just kind of makes you like go do it and like hack on things, and like you kind of are like always at night, just like everybody's gone to sleep and you're just like clickety clack, like going and building your programs. And these were all programs that they were not required by school or whatever. Like I just wanted to kind of just build software, and so that's when I kind of knew that this is interesting.
I love that. So you find your way to Amazon. And Amazon is famous for many things, and you joined it. I suppose there's exclusively interesting times at Amazon, but extreme growth. And Amazon is known for being ruthlessly efficient. And I'm curious what you learned at Amazon from like a cultural or a work ethic standpoint that still kind of shapes how you approach things today.
Yeah. So one thing, yeah, like one thing, like so Amazon has these leadership principles, right? That are pretty famous, like 12 leadership principles. And the two that kind of really kind of stood out to me were like customer obsession, which is like one of the first things, like just working backwards from like, okay, what is the customer need? And then kind of coming from that angle. But then the second thing that really struck out, like this struck out to be like the first day I kind of joined Amazon. So I had like interned at like previous companies, and I would like, like I remember like walking into the Amazon kitchen the first day and not finding soda in the refrigerator. So I come back to the team and it's like, hey, wait, where's the soda? And they just start laughing at me. And it's like, well, there's a soda machine. It's on second floor, and you'll have to pay your money to get the soda out of the soda machine. And I still remember that very distinctly. And so having interned at like what we call like really fancy places before, and coming to Amazon on the first day, kind of realizing, okay, well, this is like, and then I worked at this. So that frugality is just built so much into Amazon. And I don't know, I grew up in India, so I grew up in a very resource constrained environment. So it kind of just resonates. And that's something that we still follow here at Syft as well. So the resourcefulness, but just not in terms of those things. It's just like everything at Amazon is done sort of, or at least when I was working there, at an extreme speed with extreme like resource limitations. Even though you would say like you were working for like a really large company, but within it was like, so the first project that I used to work at, that I got hired into, and I was the first external hire into this project. It was like a secret project, so not even people in Amazon knew about it. And it was this product called CloudFront, which is like the CDN that they have.
Okay, yeah.
And the sort of internal code name for it was AWS 100. And the reason why it was AWS 100 is because they wanted to build it in 100 days, which is like unheard of.
Wow.
And so like that thing is just baked into the product name itself, that you gotta launch in 100. I don't think we ended up launching it in 100 days. I think it was a little bit more than that, but like that just focus on just relentless kind of resourcefulness and speed is what kind of was like. And that's why I think like a lot of people who work at Amazon, just like, it has such a culture. Like it's a great place to start your career, because like it just gets hammered into you that, like you have this, can you do it in like a fraction of the time, a fraction of the money? Can you do it in a way that like satisfies, like, works for our customers? And so that was like a great training ground for me.
I love that story. It's an incredible project title. So you then go on to work at Snap during another like explosive growth time. And so two companies that have similarities, they also have differences. I'm curious, if anything that you learned about building products at Amazon got flipped when you joined Snap, or maybe something that surprised you that you weren't ready for.
Yeah, I think like although from outside looking in, they look very different companies. I think they both share this trait of like really focusing on customer. They just do it in a very different way. Snap is also very customer oriented. Like, when I joined Snap, I remember like I got to work with Evan, who's the CEO, on a couple of product features very early on. And I was actually, I think I probably ran the first A/B test at Snap, or first growth experiment at Snap in a way, or growth kind of hack, you might call it. While I was working on it, what I immediately realized was that he and the company culture back then, we were like 50 people back then. And so just prioritized sort of user experience, even though it was this completely against the norm. Like, just like there's a lot of growth hacking that happens in social media applications. Like they try to make like things addictive, like, they try to bring people into like, the app and all that. Like but like at Snap, I just saw that like, okay, well, we don't want to send a lot of notifications to people. We want to be very thoughtful, like, because it actually annoyed Evan and the other folks, like, because, and they were all fairly young folks as well compared to me and other people who kind of came in later. But they wanted to build a piece of software that just actually worked for their user base. So they were so in tune with that demographic, right? The sort of the high school, college demographic, because they were those users themselves. And so they built a product, and there is a reason why that product works for that demographic is because they built it for themselves in a way. And sometimes you would say, like, from some outside in, it's like, oh, well, like this probably doesn't make business sense to not be able to kind of, send out this many notifications or whatever it is. And it's like, no, we don't want to do it. So there was just this sort of focus on user experience, which somebody more business minded would kind of say like was like hurting the bottom line or whatever. But no, like they thought the long term that was the right vision, and they were proven right. Like there's like people who use Snap day in and day out, and like they love that product. And so I would say, to answer your question specifically, the thing that kind of got flipped a little bit for me was sort of Amazon was like a very this like sort of data driven culture, like very much like like sort of customer obsessed, but also like very kind of business driven culture. And Snap was like more like not almost like Apple like, but almost like just really kind of focused. As Amazon was more MVP culture, if that makes sense. Like just kind of get it out, get the value into the hands of customers, and like so on. And Snap was a little bit more, and then iterate based on data. That like a lot of startups kind of do that, I think, as well. Snap is a little bit more like, okay, let's nail the customer experience, let's and Snap executed fast as well. It wasn't as if this was happening slow. It just was like, it was more qualitative. Let's see what our users tell us. Let's use our product ourselves diligently. Like one thing that surprised me when I first joined is like how much Evan and Bobby were in the product. Like like there were literally like reports coming in every minute from Evan or Bobby. And so like that was just like, so they lived the product and they qualitatively knew instinctively what was working and what was not working. Just a very different way of getting to where they needed to go, but just different approaches.
That's interesting. And so I'm curious, as an engineer, how you then shift to kind of programatize, if that's a word, retention. Like we think about it as, notification, re-engagement loops, but you're saying like, I need to take a step back, focus on some of the qualitative aspects of the customer experience, taking feedback from my team. And so that becomes maybe a less database challenge for you. How do you change your behavior to facilitate that?
Yeah, and I think that was definitely like one of the things that was like challenging for me personally. Like the fact that going from a very sort of data operational kind of place, which is Amazon, it's like super famous for operational excellence and like just operations in general, very data driven, to this place which was like very much. I think the thing worked for me was also the same thing. Is like pretty much everyone at Snap just used the product very religiously, and so since we used it for ourselves, we kind of sometimes you can just like ignore the data, right? Like you can, I know because I live that product day in and day out. I don't have to tell me like this doesn't work. Like I know it doesn't work, or it's not work as in terms of like in terms of its mechanics, or like in terms of its user friendliness and so on. So I think that was like a big kind of that's how that what really helped me. It's like just like being in the product, and the company culture was such that everybody used the product like day in and day out. And so that would be my advice to a lot of like to people. Is just like use your product every day, day in and day out, right? And just like for certain products it's easier, for certain products it's a little bit harder, but wherever you have the opportunity to do it, you should do it. Like we use Syft for ourselves, and so like that gives us the feedback loop, and then our customers also give us feedback, but we not put our own product.
So how does that inform? I think that's really astute. And so for product, you have to have both. You have to have, the data, and then you have to have like embedded knowledge, and it's in your culture. How does that impact how you make decisions otherwise, where you have a treasure trove of data telling you something? How much do you rely on that? Like, what's your decision-making framework look like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't know if like, we always had the right answer for this, right? Which is that often what will happen is that like, okay, you have a particular direction in which the product needs to go, and you have that vision. And then like, there is like the short-term things that like, maybe the data kind of tells you something otherwise. And we definitely had cases like that at Snap, where like like we had things that we want to change, and then like the data would like probably like would not like line up with like that broader thing. I think you have to make sure. One thing that I learned, and I wouldn't have said this if I hadn't worked at Snap, was that like like the for the broader picture, like no A/B test is going to take you where you want to go. This like that just is like an A/B test is like a sort of at best a validation, or like a lot of data stuff is just a validation invalidation thing. It's like the intuition that you have around your product and our users, and like your vision, that kind of sets the direction for you. Sometimes the data will conflict with it, and at that point it just is a matter of courage and like a business decision that you have to kind of make, and then you go right, and so like in the fullness of time, it's gonna like work itself out. Right now I'm gonna take a hit. And like there's a very famous example of it with Snap, which was this like redesign that happened in 2018 that almost kind of took out the company, if you remember. Like where the app changed quite a bit, but like there was this feeling within the company that that's like, or at least like that's how I kind of Evan and Bobby kind of expressed it. It's like okay, we need to go in this direction where like we have to separate this concept of friend content from like influencer and commercial content, right? And so they were kind of mismatched. I don't know if you have used Snap, but like they were mashed together in one screen. And for them it was just a very deeply philosophical thing that like, okay, social media is fake because like it just merges those two things together. And it's like we should separate the social from the media, so to speak. And that redesign, if you think about it, it's like like if you like when you do that, it had implications on the engagement and so on. And it kind of and then the A/B tests kind of proved them out. Like we knew about them, that like as we rolled out, like, okay, well, this is going to do that. But like the business felt that was the right way to go forward into coming. They had a very good philosophy, they had a very good reason about this, and they stayed true to that thing. It was a bit of a like thing. There were execution missteps as well in how that separation was done, but like over a period of time that kind of just worked out really well. And kind of differentiated the product from other social media products where the distinction isn't there. So that's one very like example that kind of sticks out. Where
That's a that's a great example of developing an intuition and then being able to trust it above all else. And so that leads into my next question: is you obviously didn't rely on A/B testing to start Syft, because A/B testing would have told you to stay at your amazing tech job and keep rolling. But you ventured out and started Syft, and I'm curious, what was it that was pulling at you and convinced you that this is where you wanted to push your chips?
yeah, so yeah, I always wanted to do a startup, like at some point in my career, because I think that would have been just like although the odds are like it's much, as you said, like much safer to kind of just work at a super successful place. And I had the fortune to have worked at a couple of them. But I think that it would have been just like a great experience for me professionally, as well as like, and I just didn't want to do a startup just for the sake of doing a startup. Like I think it was like over a period of years when you work in a space. For me, I worked in data, I worked in product, I worked in growth. And so towards the end, I kind of saw like there's this gap of like, okay, well, everybody relies on data so much to grow their business, to grow the app, right, to grow retention and acquisition. And we just saw like, we saw that like product teams in general just didn't have really good data to kind of grow to help with their objectives. And so, and I was just incredibly frustrated as well with like some of that stuff. And we solved some of those problems at Snap internally. So some of my teams built a lot of the tooling around data, collecting data from all these users at Snap and so on. So at a really large scale. So when we left, we were like, yeah, why is it so hard to iterate on product? Like, why is it so slow? Like, why wouldn't people want to like, it's not that we are limited by code. Now, like AI writes actually even faster code. And so like, so it's not that. It's just that people's understanding of what's working and what's not working kind of is just limited by a lot of things. And data is one of the biggest things. So we started with that premise. And we saw that like growth teams, more like product growth teams, just didn't have good data. And they were blocked a lot on engineering and other resources to kind of get the data to make like, to understand what is working, what's not working. And then we soon realized that like, it's not the growth product teams that are almost always data deprived. The people who are data deprived are actually on the GTM side, like the growth marketing teams, the growth, like, business development teams and so on. So that's where we kind of, there was this like little shift in persona for us, which was like, okay, well, because we really wanted to kind of find the bottleneck, where the bottleneck was in terms of growth. And so that's where we kind of started focusing on, and that's kind of just took us on this path. But it really started as this personal pain point as growth people, that like, why can't you grow your business fast enough? And like, what are the bottlenecks in that thing? And we felt that like data was like the biggest thing.
What was that like for you personally to say like, okay, we lived this in product, and I'm sure you were very adjacent to all the go-to-market stuff and probably had your hand in some of it, but now you mentioned shifting persona to one that you maybe haven't lived as much. What was it like for you to have to learn that and get intimate with that new persona?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it was. I mean, we knew a few people in like on the marketing and growth side of the house, but like, yeah, like our backgrounds are more from the growth, from the product side. I think it just came naturally a little bit because like like we come from a B2C, like Amazon was B2B, AWS, but like this was B2C, Snap was. Although there were B2B aspects of Snap as well, where we work with our advertising partners and so on, because like that's how we make money at Snap. But yeah, like I think for us, the thing was that in B2B, there is another shift that's going on, right? In B2B, there is like a PLG shift, right? Where like pretty much like the product leads to growth, right? And so product led growth is bringing B2B a little bit more closer to B2 in terms of like how acquisition works, how kind of, so that was a good starting point for us to kind of, just talk to, we had people in the network. And so like, and so even today we work with like, PLG companies, the growth leads there and so on. So that's not that far from like, how like growth works at a B2C company in a way. So that kind of made it a little bit easy. Then obviously there are other functions in the GTM space that are like a little bit farther, that like, we have to kind of build a little bit more empathy, like business development, sales, and so on, that those were a little bit farther off. But like people who work on growth, people who work on acquisition, marketing, I think that was like an easier thing to kind of bridge and like, build some shared ground with them.
I've had to do kind of the reverse,
Yeah.
making myself think a little more B2C, a little more product, a little closer to it. So I totally understand that. From an outside perspective, the go-to-market data space is evolving quickly and it looks competitive. Can you help me to categorize the space and kind of understand the evolution that it's going through?
Yeah. So like it's a big space, right? Like and I think data is part of it, but like, the whole GTM tech space is so there was MarTech before, and then now we have sales tech, right, as well. And there's a little bit of CS tech, like there are startups that cater to like, but sort of that whole GTM tech space, which kind of caters to marketing and sales and to a certain extent customer success. It's just going through like a profound shift right now. And there's a lot of investment going on in that space. And I think partly that's because if you just take B2B software and B2B tech as the segment, like the cost of software is kind of actually going down to zero, or like, it's diminishing. And so like, the GTM budgets are actually the more bigger part of your costs, right? Like R&D costs are just kind of just like shrinking a little relative to GTM costs. And then there is obviously a lot of bloat on the GTM side as well, especially from the ZERP era. Like, there's just a lot of, and so like I think there's just like a lot of both of those factors, which is like these things were bloated to begin with. And the fact is that like they are just going to, relative to the R&D costs, they are just going to be a bit bigger now because the R&D costs are coming down faster than the GTM costs are. And so that's why I think there's just a lot of interest in this space. And I think MarTech itself was like a big space, and now it's kind of bringing in other roles, which is actually the more fascinating part of this whole space, right? Like it's just like there's a lot of like new players in sales enablement, and lots of like like data is kind of just revolutionizing how sales teams do stuff. You yourself work in that space, you build in that space, and so RevOps, like there's a lot of functions that are just being empowered by technology. So I think that's what makes it looks competitive from outside in, right? I mean, you build in this space, you kind of SaaS in general is competitive, but I think GTM tech is like just. But I also feel that this is a huge market, right? Like and it's not a shrinking market actually. It's relatively, as I said, in terms of spend, it's a bigger fraction of everybody's spend. I would say like if you categorize the market, there are like very broadly there are like three layers to it. So one is the data layer, and the data layer is where like you get like you buy data from a lot of different, like ZoomInfo is a classic data player, but then there's a whole supply chain of it, right? Just like they procure data from a lot of different places. So either they generate the data, they get it from some place, or they buy the data and then they aggregate it. And so we do some aggregation ourselves, right? Like we kind of buy a lot of data sets around, like for example, de-anonymization. We have a lot of data relationships with different data providers. And so that's like the data layer. And then so either you're generating data or you're aggregating it. And then there is the second part of which is the orchestration layer, which is like how you kind of take this data and kind of send it different places so that you can kind of do all sorts of interesting stuff with it. You want to drive a sequence, you want to kind of, drive like, some sort of like territory planning, trigger some like lead enrichment, inbound management, calendar scheduling, all of that. So there is this like little bit of an orchestration layer. I would say Clay is a very good example of an orchestration layer, right? We do some orchestration as well on our side, mostly from the inbound side, but that's the second kind of layer. This layer is just going through a profound shift as well because of AI, because now generally like humans had to orchestrate a lot of things, and now like AI can kind of orchestrate things on your behalf, which is kind of fascinating. Zapier is the classic orchestration thing, right? It kind of orchestrates things for you. And then the third one is applications layer, where like, you're actually building the applications. The orchestrator is orchestrating things inside the application. And that layer has like lots of layers, right? Like it's just sort of, that's it. And that also is going under a profound shift right now, because like all are rethinking what does an application look like. Like, does it have to be like all these clicks and like, tons of buttons and so on, or is it like something like very, very simple and just like an agent and just so all of that is kind of fairly fascinating. I think when it comes to kind of GTM, our belief is that all of this is going to be as good as the data that powers it. Like the AI generally, it's AI is just like a data driven play. And so like, and so for us, the big bet has always been that like, okay, it's going to be as good as the data you give it, and it's going to be as differentiated as the differentiated data that you give it. So I think that is the part that people miss, which is that your GTM is like your product, right? It has to be differentiated just like your product. And if your GTM has to be differentiated, then the data that feeds it has to be differentiated. And so if you're just going to go and buy the same intent data, buy the same kind of data that everybody has, then it's just like, you're not going to get anywhere farther, because everybody's operating on the same data that you are. Your competitors are doing the same thing, right? And so for us, like when we, like even right now, like we are big believers in first party data, because that by definition is just only you have. And so like that's one thing that you can kind of do. But then there's a lot of, I had a LinkedIn post about it the other day. It's like there's a lot of like data that resides in your CRM. A lot of it is first party data, right? That you can kind of use to kind of generate data that's very specific to your business, right? Like it's just like if you have like 5 customers that are your ideal customers, go use those 5 customers to kind of figure out what were their buying journeys, what were the signals that kind of met, what triggered them to go buy like a territory planning software, right? And depending on your product, the more differentiated your product is, the more differentiated your ICP is, the more differentiated those buying journeys will look like, and then the more differentiated kind of data that you will find from those people, and that should kind of feed back into your AI and all of that stuff. So I think anyway, so I think that's a little bit of a different topic, and so I'm just digressing. But like I would say like the broader space is this data orchestration application. It can be categorized in these 3, and it's just like all of these all of these layers are in flux right now. Yeah. Even the data layer is in flux, because again, because of LLMs, you can actually go and generate data for any niche. Like there's this guy Jordan Crawford, and he does a lot of like, he shows how to do it with clay. And essentially I joked the other day with him, it's like you build a Zoom info for a very weird niche in an hour using LLMs, right? And so like even that layer, the data layer, is going a profound shift because of AI.
When you told me about him, I went and watched about 6 hours of his videos over the weekend. And that concept of building a niche Zoom info, it just makes so much sense. And I want to pick up on something you said here, because I could ask you for an hour about the data supply chain, but we'll have to do that in another show.
Yep.
You mentioned that I'm curious about you having to meet customers where they are versus knowing where the art of the possible is. So you said your data has to be differentiated in your to make your go-to-market differentiated. And then some companies are here, and that they think to get here they need to buy the same intent signals as everybody else. And you alluded to it a little bit, but how do you coach them to start thinking about getting from one starting point to the end point and avoiding some of the pitfalls?
Yeah, I think there is always, with data, there is always this what I call like paralysis that people have, which is like whatever I have is not good enough, and it shows up in like a lot of different ways, right? Like we don't have enough. Like what our product does is like you put us up on your website, and we collect a lot of first party data from it. So a lot of people will be like, oh, my website doesn't. We have like a project 6 months later, and so we'll collect more data from like and then we'll have more visitors and more like inbound and so on. And so I think that's like there is this the first problem or first mistake that people have is just that like there's always like I will have more data at some point in the future, and that will make it better for me. And I think that's just the wrong way to think about it, right? You just start where you are right now. Like take the data. There's plenty of data people have uh, in their CRMs. There is plenty of data that you have, even like even from the even if like 1,000 people show up on your website, that actually tells you like something about what your ICP is, and like what kind of content. And that's something that Syft helps you with, by the way. But so that would be the first thing. It's just like sort of this mindset of like, oh, there is scarcity of data. No, it's not. You have actually decent amount of first party data. Now, it might not be as much as you can go and find from third party sources, but it's your data. Like it's a much more higher quality than whatever else somebody will sell you. So I think that's kind of a big trap that people run into. And then the second thing is just like sort of like, okay, you have this data, like now what are we going to kind of, the set of data that you have, like how do you activate it? And that's the second part, which is that right now there is just like a lot of noise in the market about signals and signal based selling. And like, I know it's kind of a oxymoron, I'm talking about noise in the context of signal, but like there is like, but a lot of signals do generate noise in a way. And I think signals are incredibly valuable. But there is again the same thing around like, okay, well, which signals? Like, do I need a lot of signals to make progress? Because everybody's just throwing out these playbooks and like, here are 10 signals and there are 1,000 playbooks that you can run on different combinations of these things and whatever. And I think the simpler thing is just to kind of go take some of the most valuable ones that you have, right? The inbound ones are the most valuable one but just take a few set of them. Again, go do 5 customer interviews, and your customers will talk to you and just like say like, like when you decided to buy us, what were you looking at? What was the, and that will give you ideas around like, just like what kind of signals matter to them, right? They discovered you, they pay you now. So they must have, there must have been some signals that they showed, and then just work off those things that they will say like, okay, you wrote this case study that like really resonated with me. Great, set up a signal on the case study and like, and start there. So I think there is just sort of a, that's the corollary to the like, we don't have enough data to like, okay, well, there are so many other sources of data, which ones do I kind of buy or get, like, no, just work with the ones that you have and just go from there. And that's differentiated signal again, because you're working off from like your customers, not some guru who kind of said, here's a playbook that like, on LinkedIn that I used and like I generated like $1 million worth of pipeline because of that. Like, you shouldn't believe everything that comes out on LinkedIn, but like, like just sort of fine, read those things, but like, you can get started much more quickly.
I love that. You have soda in the fridge, so you don't need to always go and buy one. If we take it back to your Amazon parallel there.
Right.
So you've been at the intersection of data, product, and engineering during a really like the perfect time for that. I'm curious, what's like a mental model or framework that you use that works for you?
Yeah, so this is the question that I kind of struggled with when you first kind of hinted that you will probably ask something along those lines. And so like maybe just clarify it for me. Like when you say that like mental model, is it like around product or like on, like maybe give me an example so I can kind of give you.
Yeah, it is a generic question as I look at it. I think what I'm trying to ask is a mode of operating or problem solving that you go by as the CEO of the company, or a way that you choose to approach things, or maybe that your partners or people that work with you would say like, okay, that's his approach.
Yeah, I think me and my co-founder Nagesh, we are sort of very much, we are on the same wavelength around how we think about problems. And this kind of and this is very important when you're a founder and you're working in a very sort of a resource constrained environment, right? You can be like, and so focus is extremely important. I think for us, just again, like, and I alluded to it, is just that for us it's like customers hire us for a job, and what do we need to do for that job to get done? And often what we will see is that parts of that job will be done by our software, and parts of the job will stay outside of our software, right? And so the constant thing that we are always thinking about is like, okay, well, how can we make you finish that job? And sometimes we'll go in and do some sort of like, okay, let me go look into your like, like your HubSpot setup and see like whether like, the data that we are sending in and like orchestrating in HubSpot, is it like, triggering the right kind of things and so on. So I think that's kind of, and then if you build that mental model of like, okay, well, they didn't buy your software. they hired your software to do
Yeah.
a job. And this is not a novel insight by any means, right? Like there's a whole framework around it, the jobs to be done framework. But I think it's a very good framework, especially in this time where sort of because of technological changes, you can kind of really think of your software as a person that is getting hired in a way, right? And so that kind of just helps us a little bit around like, okay, what are the gaps? And there are a lot of reasons why the job can't be done efficiently today, right? Part of it is like a gap that your software is filling up, but like there is process problems, there are people problems, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens. And so for us, it's just like we always look at like, from that perspective. It's like, just like what is that job, and like how do we fix these other gaps? And I think that's one of the most fundamental problems that like I think that we have right now in the B2B space, which is a lot of software just gets bought and then not doesn't get used, and because it just never had like that like end-to-end thinking around it. And I think some of it is also like, and this is probably a hot take, but like some of it is also like, and there have been things where people have used certain GTM techniques to kind of just, like for example PLG, like it's a great idea, but like most of enterprise software is is not PLGable in my experience.
Yeah.
And so like again, you just have to kind of be just focused on that mental model of like, in that bigger job that needs to be done, where do I fit in? Where is my scope? And like, how can I kind of help the customer get there?
That's a beautiful answer to a poorly asked question. The job to be done framework. I like that because it resonates a lot with what we do. Sometimes you wonder why isn't this happening in the software, and you have to. It's not about you, right?
It's not about you, exactly. It's like something else that you need to kind of, and it's not always, there's not always a technical answer to it. Sometimes you just have to kind of, but it is like, but it needs to be solved, right?
Yes.
And no amount of self-serve software or whatever that, it's not gonna change it. That's why I think like people have so much challenge going from a single player mode in multiplayer mode in PLG, because really the value gets unlocked when it is multiplayer, not when it's single player. And that's where like you are asking an entire organization to change how they operate, and that's a very different problem than somebody deploying it just for themselves and getting value out of it. Like shifting the behavior of an entire group versus like a single person, just it's completely different thing.
I love that. And you're a startup founder, so you are an eternal optimist by trade. I'm curious what you're most excited about for the next decade of.
Yeah, I think for me it's there's just so much going on in the world right now, right? In terms of like like obviously I've said AI so many times in this talk, but like I think that's like one big shift that's happening. So I think fundamentally how we think about software is gonna change, which is quite exciting. I have lived through like at AWS or worked on cloud, that was great. At Amazon, at Snap did mobile, which is like great. And now we are in this third wave, and being a builder during that time is super exciting for me. Like although it's very challenging to be a founder, but like it's as good a time to be building as ever before. So super excited about like just the how we think about software. How does it change? Previously it was like, yeah, you can make it available to everyone through cloud. You can make it available now in your pocket, and now it's like, like what is the new modality? Like we're all trying to figure it out. So super excited about that. I would say also pretty optimistic about like the sort of the second order implications of a lot of these things, right? Like, okay, well, like if you're not going to be sitting in front of our computers all day clicking on things and like like doing all of this, what happens? Like what is the sort of the sort of, especially in GTM, where does that take us? And so like one of the things that we are very bullish about is this idea of like, okay, well, the the there are channels that are going to be very, very important going forward. Like human channels are going to be very important. Trust is going to be very important, right? And so like what we are doing right now, face to face, is very important. And so like I think that is going to be the sort of the currency in terms of like how software gets kind of sold and bought. And so I think I'm super excited about how that kind of comes about. We have some things that we are kind of working on that kind of will hopefully make a little dent in that process and help people build trust a bit more. But I think that's kind of the other thing that I'm super intrigued about, which is that how do you go beyond just sort of like this digital kind of interactions that we have today that are easy and accessible, but they're not high trust building, to like interactions that are a little bit on the heavier side, but are more trust building, right? And we are already seeing it play out. Like we're seeing it play out, like, email outreach is a classic example right now. Like everybody's just blasting out, email to people, to prospects and so on. And that thing is on a path to diminishing return, because the channel used to be very valuable before, but now it's just so accessible, so low cost, that it kind of just loses its resonance. And I think there are channels that AI will make better, and then there are channels that probably it will make noisier. And so like just in terms of GTM, trying to kind of figure out like which ones are going to be interesting and which ones aren't going to be interesting, which ones are, there are some fundamental truths about how humans transact, and like what are those fundamental things that like AI can't change. And I think figuring that out is actually going to be very interesting as well.
What's a story that prospective customers tell you, or you head into the market and it makes you just want to pull your hair out?
Yeah. So one thing that is always interesting is, so we are in the space where, like, we use signal data, intent data that we collect, and then we help you kind of, use that data to kind of uh, build better pipeline. And one thing that people always kind of think about signals and like data and so on is that a lot of the data is almost always in service of what I call demand capture, which is like, okay, well, if somebody's showing a signal, then they are in market. And since they're in market, let's just send them a message saying like, hey, do you want a demo, or like, do you want to, like, a very transactional kind of a thing where, like, like the outreach tends to be very transactional. And I think this is like somewhat like also reinforced by a lot of messaging around the signal based movement and like, intent data movement, which is just like all this data is in service of capturing demand that is like almost ready to buy. And it turns out it's actually not true, right? Like, it's like at any point of time, I think LinkedIn did a study, like 3 to 5% of your TAM is in market, which is like a very small fraction of it. But then everybody uses data to kind of assuming that like the data is pointing them to the 3 to 5% of people. And in fact, it's not always the case. I think the most frustrating part of this has been just that, like, okay, people buy these solutions and buy this, like, like, hey, if I use Syft or any other solution, I would immediately get, like, yes, there are a fraction of people that you will get who are showing high intent, but high intent doesn't always mean that, like, they're ready to buy tomorrow. Like, B2B sales cycles are long. You have to kind of, like, nurture that demand and, like, work on that demand and move them down funnel. So that has been kind of always frustrating. And it's doubly frustrating because, like, everybody around on LinkedIn and whatever you hear, it's always like, you use this place and, like, suddenly you'll kind of book like tons of meetings. Yes, booking meetings is actually a good eventual goal, but for a lot of the fraction of people who are showing intent, like, their life cycle is a bit longer than you would expect. And the higher your ACV, the more strategic accounts that you go after, the longer that it takes. But it's just, I think right now people are just like, using this data to kind of do stuff that really is counterproductive in a way. And so I think that's kind of it just makes me frustrated sometimes.
That's interesting. So they're treating the signal as a trigger. And instead of saying, okay, let's understand this and add context to it, they're saying this means go. And so
Yeah,
how
it's
do
more,
you, how,
trigger is fine. The trigger aspect of it is fine, just to clarify, but like, it's a trigger to what, right? Like, it's a trigger, like, because if you look at the buying journey, the buying journey has a lot of phases, and we don't know anything about the buying journey. You have no idea what's going on the buyer side, right? Like, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on. And all you see are the signals. That's what you see. And those signals kind of, some buying stages give you certain kind of buying signals, other buying stages give you some other kind of buying signals, and you act on those signals. And then hopefully whatever you act on kind of feeds into the buying journey, and then you start getting a different kind of signal. So that's like the loop. But the the thing that people think about when they hear about signals is just those signals always come from the last stage of the buying journey. That's not always true. And so, like, you should think of signals corresponding to the stage that they are in, and then try to act on them based on the stage that the signal is kind of somewhat telling you about. And unfortunately, everybody just kind of just skips straight to the last stage of the buying journey, because that's
the demo?
every signal is kind of telling you that, right?
Okay, I like that. So still set up triggers, but make sure that you understand where the signals are in the cumulative signal buyer journey, and make sure that your triggers are reflective of that and respectful of the customer
Yeah, and your
problem.
actions are reflective of that thing, right? Like, you're just like, you shouldn't be like trying to sell someone a demo when, like, their buying journey is not indicative, or the signal is not indicative of their true buying journey.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. So, what's the most unexpected thing about becoming a founder?
Most unexpected thing, I think it depends on what your background has been prior to becoming a founder. So I can only speak with like somebody like, and who kind of worked in, like, sort of big tech before becoming a founder. I guess you worked at Google as well somewhat
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
But I think what I have seen with like founders of my vintage, so to speak, or like, like my kind of background, and me personally, is just that becoming a founder has been sort of like, it's been an interesting exercise in being comfortable with being wrong very publicly. It's like sort of in the sense that you're making bets all the time, right? And you're making these bets very visibly, and you can just be wrong most of the times, and most people are. And, like, you were just based on those wrong, it tells you something, but it's all in the early stages. You're just validating different things, and you're kind of zigging and zagging based on that. And it's very different than sort of, if you come from a like sort of like, like, I guess the more successful you have been in a previous role, or or in your previous founder life, the more it kind of feels like, okay, well, being very publicly wrong is actually a bad idea, like, or whatever. Like, just there are actually, it's one of the principles that Amazon like are right a lot. Leaders are right a lot, like, and like in big companies and other places, like, you just like, if you have been an operator or something, like, you are actually judged on like you're making a lot of relatively safe but correct decisions. Let's just put it that. And here it's just that you have to make a few correct decisions as a founder, but like with a really big kind of upside to it. That means you make a lot of like, wrong ones in the process, because you just have to be right. You only have to get right 2 or 3 of them, and then you're there. But in the process, you make a lot of them, the wrong ones, and very visibly you make them the wrong ones, like, in front of the whole world. But that, I think, is kind of a big shift. Like, I think it just requires a different sort of courage profile that you'd probably like, a different muscle that you just never had, which is just accept that you're just going to be wrong quite a bit.
I love that. Imran, you're still running experiments and you're still driving your curiosity above all else. So I love that. And I always love talking to you because I always pick up a ton of nuggets. Thank you so much for doing this. Would love to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me and, asking those really good questions. And yeah, we can probably have another one on the data supply chain at some point.
Absolutely. I would be down